Good afternoon and welcome to the first podcast for Queensland Professional Engineering Group, or QPEG for short. So today I want to talk about electric cars, the subject being the future impacts likely to occur based on current projections and studies and awareness of how technology is going. So you've already no doubt seen there's a number of electric cars driving around, and there's a reasonable number of charging stations available to those cars around the country. However, the problem currently is the uptake is quite low, and the significance of that charging infrastructure is also quite low. Though part of why I wanted to talk about electric cars is there's an inflection point projected for 2025, the source of which is ABC and some other literature as well. So what I want to talk about is, we're not too far away from 2025 and that inflection point where the affordability of electric cars is supposed to surpass that of the current commercial car range of unleaded diesel cars. And I guess why are electric cars the focus? There are other transportation options. So the future projection of electric car and vehicle ownership, 2025 was indicated from an ABC article with some various sources behind that. Whilst it's projected that's being 5 years, that could move either way, more likely in Australia to be further away from 2025, just given Europe and the US are generally ahead of us by a couple of years, and the federal government incentive schemes for sustainable cars is currently non-existent. So that is also the opposite of other countries which have a percentage rebate for electric cars. So some of those factors considered will likely push the inflection point for the Australian market out a couple of years. But generally speaking, we'll hit that inflection point at some point. It's inevitable, in which the majority of cars will be electric in terms of being purchased. Part of the understanding in terms of what I wanted to talk about today is a couple of important factors. So average life expectancy of a car is one point. NBC News previously reported this to be 8 years. That was in about 2006. But in the last 14 years, there's a lot of technology advancements, and 10 years is pretty reasonable extrapolation from 8, and we'll use that just for argument's sake. And from some other research, just looking at the number of vehicle ownership in the country. So currently that's about per 1,000 people for Australia. The latest figures are saying somewhere between 700 and 750. Now that doesn't give you the metrics of how many cars per household and whether some cars are sitting idle. It's just saying ownership. So again, some to and fro on that figure, but for argument's sake, we'll talk about 70% of the country owning a car. And then tie that into the fact that the ABS has currently a reported population in Australia of about 25.5 million people. So 70% of that, you're looking at 17.8 million cars running around Australia, and on an average 50-litre fuel tank, you're looking at 900 million litres of fuel being used, say, in a fortnightly period. And the reason I'm throwing those figures around is just to sort of look at what sort of dollar figure is going to be impacting the oil market in terms of how this will affect a range of businesses. So you take an average price of fuel, which is fluctuating more recently especially, but at $1 per litre, which is cheap, but the current price, you're looking at $900 million. It's going to come back up at some point, so $1 billion, for argument's sake, is not far from the truth. And that's, I guess, a market share that you'd see in Australia alone that oil companies are going to be losing permanently. So, yeah, just a bit of food for thought on where that money is going and the impact that that's going to have. Now, if we picture that 80% of the cars on the road are now electric, they've shifted from unleaded. You've got your 10-year life expectancy, so let's say 10% of the unleaded car population is being transitioned up to electric cars. So you're looking at 1.7 million cars coming off the road each year, transitioning up to electric. And that's only 5 years away, 10 at worst. And I'm yet to see any development applications with any conditions considering, these potential impacts in the future, whether that be a condition for a charging station, or a condition that, your infrastructure needs to have a 50-50 split for petrol versus electric. There are other impacts, obviously, universal charging cords, and I think the car industry is still obviously got a long way to go in that space, but we'll have a similar issue as we've had with other adapters in different industries, and each brand and company fighting to have their own adapter to gain market share and revenue. So impacts within my career currently, for those of you listening, I've got at least 30-40 years of working life left to go. So 10 years is a drop in the ocean compared to the 40 that I'm yet to go. So it's just a point to say that any of you currently practicing in engineering, there's not long to go, and this will affect, a large proportion of a lot of industries in the engineering space, electrical, civil, traffic, hydrology. So in less than half of that remaining career, 80% of all vehicles will theoretically be in demand of charging stations and not petrol, and so there are an array of impacts from that. So if we move on to impacts now, what challenges are there? What planning requirements will there be? And if you start thinking about that, electricity, for starters, doesn't require freight. So, there's a reasonable drop in the demand for freight. The freight of fuel over that 10-year period you would expect to be dropping at some sort of general linear decline. The percentage of heavy vehicles on our roads reduces, theoretical pavement lives are prolonged, and the actual need for fuel stations becomes less relevant as the most practical way to charge an electric vehicle, 30 to 60 plus minutes, is no longer going to be a service station if you have to sit there for that long. It'll be in places like your home or the shopping centre or at your place of work or car parks. And this will, or it should, progressively change how transport generation rates are calculated for different developments. So understanding the future changes there, that's going to have a reasonable impact on how traffic engineering is done. And that's going to take some time once that transition has occurred to actually get the accuracy in place. But we need to start thinking about that now, I guess is the point I'm trying to make. And I guess there'll be the same issue there'll be a lot of people with resistance to moving to electric cars, and more affluent, you would expect, will continue to prop this market up. But the majority will inevitably move to electric cars, and as we've seen with the domestic electricity market, where this transition has continued with solar panels, what we'd expect is the suppliers are going to have the same overhead costs spread on less people. So companies will either produce less fuel at greater overheads and it will cost consumers more, or companies will produce the same fuel but they can't sell it, and so that same cost is spread across a lot less consumers and the price goes up. So I guess the ability to charge an electric vehicle still remains to be one of the hurdles in the uptake. And the purchase of a house battery will only become more attractive as a solution as that pickup occurs and affordability works, because it's not only making your fuel from day-to-day operations free, but you'll cease to have, assuming the battery size is to your needs, you'll cease to have an electricity bill. And this is obviously a big impact and risk for Ergon. They've already got net negative issues through the middle of the day, but they're obviously going to have a much greater issue as this transition occurs, which isn't far away for them either. And I know they're having issues with trying to resolve that currently. So there's some planning considerations too there that can be discussed in a little more detail. And I mean, part of that would be there needs to be regulations about outlets and plugs. So I see, Australian standards will have to reflect these changes, or new Australian standards to reflect what requirements need to be. You've got America on a different voltage to Australia to Europe. So even if there are infrastructure developments overseas, they're going to have to do additional work to get that infrastructure and capacity over here in Australia. Like other devices, we don't want to end up with companies that keep on changing their plug type to force consumers into updating their vehicles or buying a converter. So I think that would be beneficial to get a grasp on early in the piece, so that companies aren't controlling or having a major influence like there's been in the mobile phone market. We'll see where that goes. Electricity demand is another consideration that sort of flows on from that. I guess you think of all the energy that cars require from fuel that'll be transitioned directly to the grid. So we're trying to be more sustainable, but currently a majority of Australia's power is coal-fired, and especially once everyone returns back from home in the evenings, and we already have that spike once everyone gets home. So people put their car on charge, everyone at 5 o'clock, and bang, there'll be a major spike in usage. There is monitoring from electricity companies currently for this reason, but again, this will become more prevalent and needed as we move forward. So charging whilst shopping or working, this to me seems like a good outcome. I can charge my vehicle as I go and do my grocery shopping. Will shopping centres offer free or discounted charging to get patronage? You have to pay a certain amount for your groceries and get your car charged for free? This would be interesting for the Coles versus Woolworths petrol station wars. And would the charging vehicle at the office become a perk for a job? There's a range of considerations to make. What can be done now is a good section to talk about as well. So developers, what should they be considering? I mean, they should be aware of these changes from a return on investment perspective. If you've got that transition happening in 5 to 10 years, and the vehicles are starting to transition to electric, their return on investment is going to be dropping. And I think, just like I discussed earlier, the whole relevance of a service station sort of becomes less and less as we move in that direction. So I just don't see the future viability of service stations moving forward beyond that 5-year mark. There'll obviously be that that 10-year transition of the uptake, and if somebody buys a car in 2025 or 2030 that's unleaded, you get that 10-year life expectancy. It's then 2040 before they actually need to buy a new car and get a replacement vehicle. So it may push out longer than 10 years, 10%. It might push out 15 years, whatever that may be. But I guess that's the risk to anyone in the development game, looking at service stations or something of that nature. Local and state governments, I think they should be collaboratively aware of this future change from a planning perspective, and start to understand how legislation and development applications should be handled to ensure that this future piece of infrastructure is available at the time it's required, and not find that half the country has an electric car and then start to look at changes to Australian standards and conditions in the Planning Act. State and federal government, similarities and differences in awareness. They need to be aware of the impact this will have to all producers and electricity providers, and begin discussions with them so that when supply for fuel and electricity exceeds demand, production capacity and jobs have been downscaled or successfully redirected into different markets. And the impact to electricity providers remains a complex issue that will not be solved overnight. It'll take a lot of smart people to solve that issue. Consumers, they should be aware of these changes and look at the affordability of a battery for your house in your situation between now and then. If you're going to purchase an electric vehicle and a household battery for a similar price to a car that runs on unleaded, you're not only procuring a vehicle that has zero cost for fuel, like I said earlier, much more likely to have zero cost of electricity in the house. So, a couple of different points there. Now what I'd like to do just to say thank you. That concludes our first podcast at QPEG, and we hope it's provoked some thought, provide some key points of interest, and bring you back for another podcast. So thanks for listening, and please don't hesitate to contact us or leave a comment below. Subscribe to the channel if you have any questions relating to this podcast. Thanks a lot.